Welcome to the Sports Ethicist Show, coming to you from the basement of Burpee on the campus of Rockford College in Sportstown, USA, Rockford, Illinois. I am Sean Klein, the Sports Ethicist and Philosophy Professor at Rockford College. The Sports Ethicist Show discusses the many ethical and philosophical issues that arise in and around sport. You can read the Sports Ethicist blog at sportsethicist.com, where you can also download podcasts of previous shows, subscribe to the podcast, or find links to related information. The Sports Ethicist is also on Facebook and Twitter, so you can like us or follow us. On Friday, April 19th, Rockford College hosted the second annual Sports Studies Symposium. We had two panels of three professors each from 6 different universities talking about various issues in sports from a philosophic perspective, a historical perspective, perspectives from a literature perspective, and so on. It was a very interesting day and a lot of interesting topics that came up. After the symposium, I sat down and continued the conversation with the participants from the panel. And so if you missed the symposium, you can listen to the show and hear from these folks about their interesting ideas. And if you were at the symposium, then you can listen to the speakers a little bit more as we delve a little bit deeper into some of the ideas that they mentioned. Hey, joining me now are Dr. Chad Carlson, Dr. John Harney, and Dr. Trisha Phillips. They were members of the first panel on today's Sports Studies Symposium. Dr. Chad Carlson, who is an assistant professor of kinesiology and sports studies at the Department of Eastern Illinois University, gave a talk on what is fan-based sport about anyway, the spur issue, and normative implications for professional sports. So, Chad, could you give a little snippet of what the talk was about, what the main idea is?
Absolutely, I will. Back in November, Greg Popovich, coach of the San Antonio Spurs, decided to sit 3 of his starters and 1 substitute when they were playing the defending champion Miami Heat. That was a decision that was met with a great deal of public outcry. David Stern fined the team heavily for that, and a lot of fans were disappointed. They didn't get to see the matchup that they were hoping. Even though it was a good game, there's some ethical issues at stake here. For instance, what do we want from our sports? What are our sports about? And I argue that we want to set up our leagues in a way that we can enhance the players' interest in playing as opposed to working the games. I also argue that at times we force our players to make decisions between winning the day and winning the season. And in the Spurs case, I think they chose the latter, and they know they have aging players. They made a decision that was prudent in many ways. Fans were disappointed at the time, but hopefully we'll be able to see a better, more refreshed Spurs team at the end of the season. And so in that sense, the consequences might outweigh the difficulties for the fans at the time.
Great, thank you. And Dr. John Harney, John, you are visiting assistant professor of history at DePaul University. And you spoke on Japanese baseball culture at the beginning of the 20th century, the imperial game or adopted pastime. So if you could give us your brief summary of your talk.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So, I study East Asia more generally, and as I mentioned in the talk, my dissertation was on baseball in Taiwan and Gaelic games in Ireland, and so I'm interested in these international comparisons, and something that historians it's not the only interpretation, of course, but historians do a lot is they look at sports, especially in post-colonial situations, such as, cricket in India, soccer in even places like Ireland and things like that. And they tend to analyse sport in terms of how it can be used by the more powerful partner in the relationship to make the colonised more like them or to alter their society in some way, and then also how the sport is used to kind of react against that. So, a good example of this would be the Australians, in fact, the Australians who take on cricket in large part because it allows them to beat England, and there's this whole kind of dynamic that's going on there. But baseball, from a very broad perspective, and the kind of the culture that grows from it in Japan at the beginning of the 20th century is quite interesting in that it doesn't fall into that all that neatly. And what I have as a kind of my little dynamic is looking at their treatment of Taiwan, which became a Japanese colony in 1895, and then interactions between the exact same Japanese baseball team, or at least the same kind of institution that was home to the baseball team, on trips to Chicago to play the University of Chicago throughout the 20th century. So it was Waseda University as this team I look at. It's a very prominent university in Japan at the time. And basically overall, I argue that whereas Taiwan kind of flourished and evolved from this distant hinterland almost of Japanese baseball into a kind of a genuine outcropping of this wider Japanese baseball community, and not just some kind of aggression-fueled kind of dynamic between Japan and its colonized people. When the Japanese went to the States, it was a very different dynamic, and the Japanese administrators and personnel around the university particularly found themselves trying to kind of speak the same patrician language almost as Alonzo Stagg and these other University of Chicago people. And there was very much, not so much looking for the approval of the United States, but kind of looking to confirm a presence at the table of the top powers they felt they already had.
Oh, great. Thank you. Dr. Trisha Phillips, who is an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy and Religion at Mississippi State University. Trisha, you spoke on fandom and sport encouraging hate, and so I was wondering if you could give us your brief summary.
Yeah, I'd love to. My idea came from the fact that a lot of people think that participation in sports is a good thing. It's a good thing for the person. I participated in organized sports as I was a child, and my child is participating in organized sports. And the common idea is that kids should do that, and it's a good thing because it helps to build character. And this has been a common assumption for a while. There's recently been empirical evidence showing that, in fact, it does not build character, that, in fact, the moral reasoning skills of athletes are lower than the reasoning skills of non-athletes. And, in fact, the longer a person plays in organized sports, the lower they go and the more difference there is. And so between this divide between, theoretically, sports should be good for you. In actuality, it's not. The response has been, well, it can be good for you, but it doesn't just happen on its own. We've got to be intentional about using sports as an opportunity for character development. I think that we should look at being a fan in the same way. I think that there are a lot of good things that being a fan can do for a person and do for a person's character and moral development. But then I also think we need to take a good, long, hard look about how fandom is commonly and currently practiced. And I think it's practiced in a way that encourages and reinforces hate. And this is a problem. And that we need to recognize this and be realistic about it, and be intentional about the way that we want fandom to assist in the moral development of a person's character. We need to coach fans from young to old in the same way that we think that we ought to coach players. Great, thanks. I wanted to start, Chad, by asking you a question about your talk. Now, the incident with the Spurs and the Heat happened, in the middle of the season, regular season. But now, we're just coming up on the end, or we ended, I think, right? There aren't any more games,
if
right?
We haven't ended, we're close.
Because the playoffs do start Saturday. At least the Celtics, my team, start on Saturday. And so a number of teams do rest, and it's not just in basketball, but happens in many of the sports. They rest their players at the end of the season. That doesn't, and there's always a little bit of a murmur about it, but it didn't seem to cause the same sort of consternation that the Spurs issue did. Do you see that as a difference? Do you think there is a difference there? Do you think fans see the shift from the long term to the short term more clearly at the end of the season? What are your thoughts on that sort of issue between the end and the middle of the season?
I think as fans, we're a little bit more conditioned to the fact that players oftentimes want to rest, or coaches want the players to rest at the end of the regular season as opposed to early on or in the beginning, which is what happened in the Spurs Heat incident. That was November. We're talking about not even a full month into the season. Right now, we see even some of the Miami Heat players taking games off knowing that they have the first playoff seed locked up. Mm-hmm. And so I do think we're conditioned. Now, whether that makes it right or not, I think that's a different story. I think I would never want to say that a professional athlete doesn't have the right to take a game off if he or she feels like they need the rest for whatever other reason. I think that they have basic rights as employees that anybody else does. However, it affects us, the fans, in a different way than it would, say, for somebody showing up at a 9-to-5 job. And so I do think they have a special obligation. I also think that when they're taking games off at the end of the regular season, although they do it to enhance their chances of playing better in the playoffs, that is to save energy, to help their bodies heal before the last push. I think what we've seen at times, especially in the NFL, is that hasn't helped teams the way that they've hoped it would help them.
Right.
And so I think there's the strategic issue, too, that's at play in terms of what these teams do.
Right, and that's often the discussion. Should we rest, lose your momentum, you get out of the flow of playing the games versus the teams that just keep the pedal to the metal all the way as far as they can go, unless there's a real injury issue.
Absolutely.
John, one of the things I wanted to ask about your talk, you mentioned at one point, and I wasn't sure if it was the local Taiwanese folks or if it was the Japanese, about the wariness about encouraging or introducing baseball.
Oh, yeah.
And you said some were wary about it, and so one was a clarification, was who was wary.
Sure.
And two, do we have a sense of why, what their hesitancy was in being wary of introducing baseball?
Right. Well, the wariness at first was on the Japanese side. So the Japanese were concerned, in fact, not just about the local Taiwanese. And by the way, in Taiwan, you get into all these different terms because there's Aboriginal Taiwanese, there's ethnically Chinese Taiwanese, and then local Taiwanese becomes a bit of a catch-all. But the Japanese in general didn't want the Taiwanese playing baseball.
Oh, okay.
But there were also principals, headmasters, people like that, who weren't entirely keen about their students playing it either, their students being ethnic Japanese too. So there was kind of not so much an explicit debate about the value of it, but certain individuals maybe didn't see it as such a great thing. And so mirroring to a certain extent how the game had grown anyway in Japan at the end of the 19th century, you've got especially people training to be teachers are getting together to play on fields and stuff like that. And they actually form a baseball association in 1915. Of course, you're recording this the one time my dates. I'm not sure of my dates.
The historian and his dates.
I know, but I think it was 1915 or so. And so from that point on, you start to see real formal tournaments and stuff emerge like that. But the first couple of decades of colonial rule, there was kind of trepidation over it. And the thing in East Asia in general, there's a lot of factors coming into this, because there's the extent to which are the Japanese worried about empowering the locals in some way? For example, their education system was very deliberately tiered in certain ways. So Taiwanese people were filtered away from liberal arts and rhetoric and things that would give them any kind of ability to question their masters at an intellectual level. But they were encouraged to become tradesmen and things like that and so on. But also on a deeper level in China and Japan as a whole, this notion of the extent to which modern sport is a British or Western kind of conception. As I mentioned in the talk as well, the classic Confucian understanding of sport being incredibly unseemly and not wanting your son to be seen sweating. You'd rather see him at the books. And that, this was a society that glorified being at the books more than being out in the field sweating, The opposite of today, one could argue. Right. In the West, anyway.
Yeah, because part of it I was wondering, was it a kind of on the Japanese part in terms of being hesitant about it, the knowing that it's a Western game as opposed to something that really organically developed, or did they view it as a Japanese game and it was more of the sort of class issue? Oh
yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head with the latter there. I think definitely that there's almost an extent like this is our game. Nobody said it was your game kind of dynamic to it. And I mean, I'm kind of, paraphrasing, but what's fascinating about the Japanese is how quickly the kind of American identity is just wiped out of the game. And it wasn't until really the 1930s or so they deliberately stopped using certain loan words like, strike and hito, words that sounded like English. But even before that, it was amazing how much it was considered a Japanese thing and seen as a Japanese thing. The high school tournament that started in the 1910s as well was this big Japanese endeavour. And there were isolated incidents of it being seen as an American thing. So teams coming over like Herbert Harrison Hunter in 1920-21, barnstorming in Japan and Taiwan. That's a moment where suddenly everyone goes, okay, let's try and impress the Americans, as it were. Babe Ruth visiting in 1934. But these are isolated incidents. Like, it's not something... this notion of it being the American pastime that Americans take it for granted is not something Japanese were growing up with in the early 20th century at all.
That's really just fascinating to me. I had no idea of that at all. As I was mentioning to you earlier, I think a lot of Americans, including myself, we just assumed that baseball was introduced into Japan around after World War II during the occupation as a way of pacifying them or westernizing them, Americanizing them, or whatever, and to see it as something that has its own organic roots in Japanese culture and in Japan is really interesting. It gives a whole new perspective to the expansion of Major League Baseball and them playing games now, their exhibition games, and to the Japanese players that come over and stuff. That it gives a very different perspective on what it means when they come over. That it's not something that they're just adopting. Really, they've really grown up with this, and it's part of their culture as well.
Oh yeah, and like also the spectacle of it as well. I mean, in the 1950s, the Americans had a pretty significant presence in Taipei because of obviously Cold War policies and military deployments and so on. And the government of Taiwan, post-Japanese leaving, weren't very pro-baseball. They were pro-basketball because that was the sport that was popular in mainland China before the end of World War II. But, now and again they would agree to publicize baseball because a local team or a Navy team or something like that was playing, Marines or GIs or something like that. And they'd present the American leader of the armed forces with a bouquet or something like this. You know what I mean? There was some kind of spectacle there. And there was nothing new about that at all. Like, they've been doing that for decades on the island and in Japan itself as well, of course.
That's really interesting. Now, Trisha, you gave a talk that was a little bit provocative, right, to probably a group of people that both in the audience and maybe on the panels that think about sport or fans of sport. I found it very interesting and found myself to some degree more convinced than I expected to be.
Well, thank you.
But I did, in recent developments, in terms of the terrible events that happened on Marathon Monday in Boston, and the fan bases and the way that they responded, both the Boston fans, in terms of which was much more expected, looking at their own teams and thinking of how that might be a way back to normalcy and things like that. But then also seeing the response from other fan bases, particularly, of course, when talking about the Red Sox, with the Yankees, and to see on Yankee Stadium a sign that says "United We Stand" with the Boston B from the Red Sox and the Yankee symbol. To see Yankee fans holding signs up for them to play the Sweet Caroline song, which is a song that's played at Fenway during the seventh inning, and so to see those things and to see Sweet Caroline was played at 10 or 12 parks on Tuesday and Wednesday after the events, and to see the responses of sort of everyone kind of being a Boston fan for a day or so. I was wondering what you thought about that sort of a fan-based response, where normally Yankee fans and Red Sox fans, although I should admit I married a Yankee fan, but we are raising our son as a Red Sox fan. Right, so normally you don't see that kind of camaraderie between Red Sox and Yankee fans and other fan bases. So I was wondering, how do you see that fitting into some of what you're arguing about?
Well, I think it's a great thing to see, and it's really heartening to see people who otherwise have very divisive relationships come together and offer support to one another in times of needs. And there's been some other occasions in the past where I've seen this happen. When the bonfire collapsed at Texas A&M back now, and I don't have my dates in front of me. I want to say that was the late 90s. Texas A&M and Texas are huge rivalries, historical huge rivalries, and when that collapsed and there was such a tragedy on the Aggies campus, Texas was one of the first responders, both with moral support and physical support in terms of resources, and they stood with the Aggies and did everything they could to help, and that was really nice to see. And then I think, and here my dates and my facts might elude me, but I want to say that perhaps the NFL football season that encompassed 9/11. I think the Patriots won the Super Bowl that year.
Yes, they did.
Well, good. Thank you. And the speech that the owner of the Patriots gave at the end of the game.
Robert Kraft.
That would be him.
I'm also a Patriots fan.
Well, good,
obviously.
good. He said something to effect that this year we are all Patriots.
Yes.
Something very unifying, right? That that sort of brought everyone together, even though they had recently been opponents, right? Probably as 20 minutes prior to that. And it is very nice and very heartening to see those things. And I would like to believe that deep down, everybody is friends. And deep down, in terrible times of need, we are unified. But I think those moments are rare. And I think more common, we're living with mild to moderate degrees of hatred. And I think that has an effect on our character.
Okay. Yeah. And I think that to some degree where I might differ from you is the sense of which is more common. And so some of that, I guess, is to some degree an empirical case, right? To look at that. And, anecdotally, it feels more common to not so much the tremendous outpouring of love really after Marathon Monday, but the sense of friendly banter between Yankee and Red Sox fans, between Steeler fans and Patriot fans, and Mike is a Steeler fan and I'm a Patriot fan, and we often rib each other about that. And so my sense, and now it's more anecdotal, but my sense is that that's more common, and that the more vitriolic aspects of it is less common. But I'm open to being wrong about that. I hope I'm not, but I'm open to that. John, you jump right in.
Yeah, sorry, if I could make a point, I think Trisha makes some excellent points, and I get interested in the different types of rivalries, whereas if you look at Europe, two teams in one city in the same league is not that uncommon. And I think I'm a Liverpool Football Club fan myself, and Liverpool and Everton have this rivalry where families are torn in two and so on, which is just like the A&M UT rivalry. And there's a certain amount of kind of fighting within the family almost that goes on. And the great example is the bonfire that Trisha brought up, the Texas UT thing. But I was at a wedding a few years ago now, where the groom demanded that all the Longhorns come and sing Eyes of Texas with him because he was just so sick of hearing the war song at A&M weddings, And there's there's so much of it that's playful and everything like that. Whereas Liverpool's rivalry with Manchester United, Liverpool fans call them scum, typically. And unfortunately, there are minorities of fans in each team that will sing celebrating the Munich air disaster, which is the Man United tragedy, celebrating the Hillsborough disaster, things like this. And Texas OU then is something where it's okay to hate Sooners. Whereas the A&M thing, it's more of a kind of you hate your brother kind of a thing. So, and I don't, by no means is this a counter to Trisha's point at all, but I just think it's really interesting because the thing I thought while you were talking, Trisha, was hatred of Yankees fans that goes throughout the entire nation of the US. So I don't know, a Cincinnati Reds fan who hates the Yankees. What's going on there? And I think that's where Trisha really starts to get a point, because that's a point where you need to kind of focus your energies on stuff that at least affects your team.
Yeah, I think that there is a lot of friendly banter, and there is a lot of fun that can go on with being a team, being a fan, and sort of provoking your opponent in a good-natured way. But I think there's a really fine line between doing this as amusement and when it gets a little bit more dangerous in terms of encouraging and reinforcing negative character traits. And I think that line is crossed too often and too common. Now, that's not to say that it is common or that it is a character trait of every fan, but I think that that it happens more often than it should.
Okay. I can definitely agree with that.
More often than it should, and we need to recognize this so that it's not reinforced.
Yeah, one of the things I'd like to add to that is I think throughout all of this conversation about love and hate and fandom, that's an important thing to look at. In many ways, sports and being fans of sports are ways in which we can connect with each other. If we don't focus on some of these differences, which I think Trisha talks about, and even sometimes when we only have the smallest of differences, she mentions that's oftentimes where we see the greatest amount of hate, real or imagined or manufactured or whatever we want to say. But I think it's important to note from all of our, at least I know I've had a lot of experiences at which I meet a new person from a new culture, and they find that I'm a Penn State grad. And the first thing they want to talk about is Penn State football. I have nothing else in common with that person except that they know that I probably understand Penn State football a little bit.
Yeah.
Same thing goes with Olympic events or any number of international events. Sport and our fanaticism of sports, or our spectatorship, I guess, to put it a little bit more accurately, are ways in which we can communicate with each other. And I think we need to keep that in mind as well.
Absolutely.
Oh, sure. I think that that sports offers a tremendous potential for international dialogue, for intercultural dialogue, even for interfaith dialogue. And it has a tremendous potential for unifying people towards a common goal, in a common pursuit, in a common form of recreation. But I think that we need to be aware that that not everything that comes along with it is good, and we can't just let it go naturally, because there are some dangers associated with it that just need to be recognized and curbed.
Sure. I think that's right. In terms of some of what came up in the second panel, that it's sometimes about how you approach it, how you balance it, keeping it balanced, and studying. To put a plug in for most of our disciplines, studying the ethics of sport, I think helps us better understand that, and hopefully we can impart some of that to our students. Chad, did you want to jump in?
Well, I was going to add, I think we get some of this culturally as well, through the media especially, and I'm thinking specifically of a commercial. I can't even remember the company. This is how strong the message through the advertisement was, but it was a young man who was driving a car. It had Ohio State Buckeye decals on it and Buckeyes on the license plate. He went to pick up a woman who, obviously, it was a first date. She got in the car, they start driving, and he asked her to tell him about herself. And she says, I'm a graduate of Michigan, go blue, stops the car and throws her out.
Right.
The perfect indication of how we can have hate embodied in our fanaticism. We don't want that to happen, and I could not see myself doing that, but
right.
I think there's a reality there that's sort of behind some of our thoughts as we're fans of sport.
Yeah, and that's obviously to some degree, I think that's a caricature and an exaggeration, but there's probably some truth to it. But just from personal experience, I know, getting on a plane and sitting next to someone, a Yankee fan, I'm a Red Sox fan, and they're sort of, but it definitely is more playing at it than real. I don't want to overplay that too much. There are times that certainly, at the end of certain games where I really do feel the hatred that you're talking about. Now, and to some degree, I think that you're right, that can be dangerous and immoral. It also might be cathartic in the same way that we, hate Darth Vader or something like that, right? That there could be not to say that, well, they are the evil empire, right? The Yankees, right? But I guess that's part of your point. Chad or John, you said something about the Cincinnati Reds hating the Yankees, and that gets into an issue of a broader issue of why a team like the Yankees or Man U get hated by so many other fans that don't necessarily have anything to gain or lose by it. It seems that might be characterized more by something like envy.
Yeah, and I mean, it's funny, like the guy, talking here about the potential for sport as well. It reminds me, I'll be the boring historian that remembers the historical point. The famous Nixon visit to China was preceded by interactions between table tennis teams of the US and China. Mm-hmm. We call it ping pong diplomacy.
Right.
Like you've probably heard of, I guess, already. And that's a side of how, the potential, I guess, is there. But certainly in our everyday lives, we see more of kind of the example that, that Chad just mentioned.
Right.
And like, in terms of envy and everything else, you see it especially in the Premier League in England in the last 10 to 15 years with the influx of big money, whereas Chelsea became even more hated. Well, they were never really hated. They weren't important enough to be hated almost. But suddenly they were millionaires, and they did this thing of buying players they wouldn't even play in their first team, and they didn't want other teams to have them. And in some cases, this had a negative effect on the careers of young English players in particular. And that became, you see, they are morally flawed in addition to all these things. And now Manchester City are the target of this,
right.
And I don't know, it's an interesting line. Like my father's a great line. Like when he's a Leeds United fan, he says whenever he sees Chelsea play Manchester United, he wishes they could both lose, Mm-hmm. That's kind of the mentality of it. But I think envy is a big part of it. And speaking as a Liverpool fan, for example, seeing Manchester United usurp them in recent years in terms of titles won and things like that, the stakes got very high for a while. These imaginary stakes of who's won the most league championships.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. It's an interesting point, and but I think Trisha definitely has a point, because there are people in our society who lose the grip of what's important, when to stop, when to say no, and things like that. And I suppose as an historian, for me, looking back over time, like, Is this something to do with social problems that we have? I can't help but think it's more to do with the individual and the social thing, building that individual. But then again, what other opportunity do you have to go in and sit there with 20,000 people and scream vitriol at someone if you choose to? That was actually one of your main points, wasn't it, Trisha? The vitriolic language.
Yeah. I think that's a symptom of this kind of hate. And Sean, you said something about, well, maybe it's a good thing because it's cathartic. And I actually don't really agree with you on that one. I don't know that it is cathartic in an isolated and discrete sense. I don't think that people go into the stands and behave badly for 3 hours and 3 hours only and then go home. I think they carry their hate with them, and it slowly seeps into their character and into the way that they think about other people, and what they say and do when they're outside of the stadium. But then also I think that there's that we should also be aware of the fact that it doesn't say very good things about us, that our recreation might be that we need to go somewhere and be hateful for 3 hours. Mm-hmm. Right? We shouldn't be very proud of that either. And perhaps we should be looking for other outlets if we have anything built up inside us that needs to come out.
Yeah, I guess my point in this, I'll let you respond to it, and then we'll have to close off. I don't want to end with the last word, although I suppose I could. It's my show, but I guess my point there was to some degree that it's because it's a game, because it's arbitrary, because it's not in some sense of any ultimate significance. It becomes a safe place to act out some of these things that we wouldn't do in other places, kind of that inner demon idea to some degree. But given that the nature of sport in terms of it being an arbitrary construction, it gives us a sort of playground to play that out. And maybe and the positive side to that, besides maybe the psychological aspect, but the moral positive that might be there, and I'm not sure it is, but maybe it is, so I'll suggest that it gives us a way to play that out and see the consequences of it and learn from that. And maybe we begin to learn that this kind of behavior, the way we feel when we hate them and then we feel bad about that, maybe we learn it and we learn it in a safe place rather than hating our neighbors or hating someone because they're a different color or a different religion and so on, that this allows us maybe to do it in a way that's safer. What do you think of that?
I would like to think that you're right.
Okay.
I really want to believe that, but my thought is that even if we're doing this on the playground, when we take our inner demon out and let it play for a while, I think that strengthens it. Okay. Rather than perhaps exhausting it so that it'll go back to sleep. Okay. I think that strengthens it, and then I think that we don't keep it on the playground. Okay. I think it comes with us when we walk away.
Okay. Well, thanks for joining me on the radio show and for the symposium. I really enjoyed all your talks. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Now we're talking to the second panel of the day, and joining me in the booth as well is my co-organizer, Mike Perry. He's an English professor here. Hi, Mike.
Hello.
So now we're going to talk with Dr. Aaron Harper, who's an instructor at the Department of Humanities at West Liberty University. And you spoke on Nietzsche and value creation and nihilism. I don't have the titles in front of me at the moment. So could you tell us a little bit about your talk?
Sure. My paper or presentation was both interpreting and building off of Nietzsche's work. So Nietzsche has this worry that our world is trending towards something he calls nihilism, which in general is some kind of meaninglessness or purposelessness. But as far as Nietzsche is concerned, it's a very personal thing that for a variety of reasons, people don't find their own lives meaningful in any interesting way, that they find their own lives boring, that they feel disoriented. In some extreme cases, perhaps they feel even disgusted about it. So this is a big problem if we're trending in this direction. And Nietzsche has a variety of suggestions for what we should do about it, including the suggestion that we should create value. And that's an interesting and provocative, but somewhat abstract and confusing claim. So in my paper, I look at play and try to examine whether play can help us get at what Nietzsche means. So the first part of the paper, I look at basically the relationship between play and fantasy. Some people might think that play helps us deal with suffering by providing an escape. or allowing us to create a pretend or imaginary world. But I argue that that's not really the case, and that play is actually something very significant, and that play allows the creation of values and things that really matter to us, that we shouldn't look at play as if it's just an illusion. In fact, it's much more than that. And then I look a little bit more about why that's the case. And I think some people believe it's just because you get to decide to play, because it's not forced, that you don't have to do it. Maybe that makes it meaningful. And I don't think that's quite enough either. So I try to put this in terms of investment, and I suggest that play allows an opportunity for us to invest in something, or to commit to something, or to immerse ourselves in something. And that, I think, shows why we don't need to be as worried about this problem of meaninglessness, or at least it provides an outlet. That play shows how we really do make things matter to us. And then I think this actually leads to an interesting conclusion, which is usually we contrast play with the real world, that play is something outside the real world. But if this Nietzschean approach is right, then it turns out play is actually really important. And play is doing something really serious, and play itself is very serious. And I think there's an important suggestion that maybe there really isn't anything outside of play, that we have it backwards when we say the play is separate from the real world, and maybe the real world is a lot like play. That would be a pretty radical conclusion, but I think it would be a pretty fascinating one as well.
Cool. Thank you. And I'll go in order that we spoke at the panel. So I'll go with next is Dr. Koehl Robinson, who is an associate professor of English at Ashford University, and spoke on, I have the titles now, Chasing the American Dream, a chubby fanatic recalls his favorite professional wrestlers. Tell us a little bit about what you talked about.
It was a little bit of an offshoot of my dissertation, which was on the language of ring sport, boxing, and wrestling. A bit of what Aaron was talking about, Johann Huizinga, why we play. The function of play is play the opposite of work. And then I did a chapter on A.J. Liebling, Norman Mailer, and George Carol Oates. The fourth chapter was on professional wrestling zines, sort of pulp fiction. And I'm going to talk a little bit of smack about my dissertation director. We'd probably all like to. He wanted me to make fun of professional wrestling, look down on it as lowbrow. And I never really wanted to do that. And ever since I graduated, most of the stuff I've written is to talk about how wrestling was important to me as a child. Chubby, hillbilly, throwing sticks at trees in the summer because my closest friend was 18 miles away. So Dusty Rhodes, the wrestler, the American Dream, makes it okay to be fat. Jimmy Boogie Woogie Man Valiant makes it be okay to be poor. Need for the baby faces, need for the heels, to be afraid of the heels, sort of monsters comparable to Hobbit or something. Mm-hmm. But the wrestlers fulfilled a need for me and for the kids of Rockford.
Thanks. Yeah, I really enjoyed your talk. I think everybody did. Now, Andy Koehl, who we're so glad you were actually able to make it. I know the O'Hare Airport and the conditions around here were a little rough for you. So now, Andy, Dr. Koehl is assistant or associate? Associate professor. Don't want to get that wrong. Associate professor of philosophy, right?
Right.
Yeah, at Roberts Wesleyan College, which is in Rochester, New York.
Correct.
And the title of your talk was Fantasy Sport and Aristotelian Flourishing. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
I prefaced my talk today by mentioning the fact that these are two passions of mine. I've been playing fantasy football for about 10 years, and Aristotle was actually the philosopher who moved me from being a business major into being a philosophy major as an undergrad. According to Aristotle, humans can only truly flourish in the context of a community. So we are like ants or bees. We're not solitary creatures. We can only flourish in the context of relationships. And so one of the curious developments over the last few decades is that in addition to local flesh and blood communities, we now have virtual relationships. We have communities that take place in cyberspace, and there's been a lot of debate about whether this is healthy for us as human beings, whether we're evolving into a different sort of social being. And what I took the opportunity to do in this paper was to argue that fantasy sports in particular can be a very effective way for doing the two kinds of things that Aristotle is concerned with, and that is the development of virtue and the promotion of flourishing as a well-rounded human experience in the context of a polis in which all of our truly human capacities are developed and expressed. The engagement in fantasy sports, just as with the engagement in sports in general, can be harmful or wonderful, depending on the pre-existing character of the person who participates in that activity. But in my experience, this is one of many kinds of human activities that can be genuinely helpful in the development of character and the development of a well-rounded, flourishing life. And this is especially important given a fair amount of fragmentation of society. Very few of us live in an Aristotelian polis, which is a community that's large enough to be self-sufficient, but small enough where everyone is known, everyone matters, and everyone can make a difference. So I think that these sorts of pursuits are actually really helpful given our current historical situation.
Oh, great. Very, very interesting. And you know, it was when Mike and I were putting together the panels and trying to figure out where it was going to go which, the three of yours seemed more, I don't want to put this, more different from each other than the first panel, which seemed that they seemed more connected. Mm-hmm. But what I think actually happened is your all three of your talks, even though they're all quite different, I think also struck a very important common theme. And I don't know if anyone else saw this, but I saw this theme as a sport, wrestling, fantasy sport, play, as all of these as ways of finding value in the world, of finding meaning, of finding your identity, mooring yourself in some way to the world, and finding that purpose, that value, that meaning, that identification. And so all your talks kind of hit out that in very different ways. But I sense that there's a theme across all of that. Did you guys pick up on that at all, or what kind of thoughts you have on that? Anybody jump in?
I was actually thinking about Carl's discussion, because when he saw various kind of wrestlers, he saw people that he could aspire to be like. And it made me think of Aristotle's teaching that the only way we can obtain wisdom is by surrounding ourselves with mentors, people that we can imitate. Mm-hmm. And so I thoroughly enjoyed Carl's presentation, and he talks in a very moving way about these characters that as a young child he could fully identify with, and he could say, you know, this is somebody whose life has meaning, this is someone who's important, this is someone who's powerful. And it impacted his character and your outlook on life. And so I thought that was fascinating.
And of course, Aristotle was influenced by a wrestler, Plato.
Right.
That's where Plato's name comes from, his wrestling days and the importance of wrestling. Although somewhat different of a form of wrestling, I think, than professional wrestling. But
Carl, at the very least,
we
know that most of this philosophy, or much of it, was occurring at the wrestling gymnasium. So
yeah,
perhaps
right,
it's
absolutely.
not a far movement away from that.
I mean, it certainly works for children. Mm-hmm. We can all play and fantasize when we're young. Sometimes the older wrestling fans don't get the same freedom. So,
mm-hmm. What do you mean don't get the same freedom?
Because it's assumed to be fake. Mm-hmm. So if you're a wrestling fan as an adult, sometimes people think something's wrong with you.
Okay.
I mean, I know my friends who are professors who still like it will go to like a small time Cleveland show. They don't watch WWE. They interact with the local fans in Cleveland. It's something about their local community.
Okay.
It's okay for the adults to play fantasy football, but to enjoy fantasy in other, I guess there's maybe just different levels to that. But
you know, this isn't my show, but I wanted to ask Carl this question because this is a follow-up to what you just said. You mentioned in your talk that you don't watch nearly as much wrestling now, and you don't go to the events the way you did when you were a child. Now that you're an adult, is it less relevant to you?
To some degree, yes. I mean, I will say in our discussion, I kind of like absurd things. And my favorite part of the whole day was when we talked about celebrity Deadpools.
I was wondering if that was going to make its way into the podcast.
So, Yeah, I mean, maybe some of your listeners listen or play Celebrity Deadpool. I'm always looking for absurd things, I think. Like that discussion, what mattered to me the most, no one really close to me has ever passed away. My parents are in their 70s, so I never really dealt with death. It might change if I had children or something happened to my parents, but a Deadpool is sort of amping up the play of wrestling, maybe.
Interesting.
Or just emphasizing the absurdity of these activities in general. I mean, I take it back to the earlier issue of what kinds of values are we finding here or creating. It seems like there's a couple of different ways we could look at it. Are sports and other forms of play helping us find these things we always recognize as valuable and helping us become these kinds of people? Or should we emphasize the fact that these values don't exist prior to the activity? And I take it, all of our talks, as well as the ones earlier, we're looking at different ways in which values emerge from these activities, and what exactly does that mean? And is it a personal sort of thing? Is it something larger? Does it have something to do with the community?
And I talked to Trisha from the other panel about she had children, and I got the feeling that my priorities would change if I had to be a role model for my children. Mm-hmm. So since I don't have anyone to be a role model for now, I can be a little more free.
Well, that's Andy and I were talking about that in terms of tempering some of our fandom, our enthusiasm for our team, and the up and down of a win and a loss, and how my son and seeing his responses can temper my behavior. Right, so I don't experience myself in the last couple seasons as getting as angry, as upset with certain conditions in the game or in the sport, because I'm thinking about how my son would see me. Additionally, when my team loses, thankfully I'm a Patriots fan, doesn't happen a lot. But sorry. No, I lost my train of thought. Oh, right. So when
he's talking to a Steeler fan here.
Yeah.
So there's a Steeler fan here as well.
Oh, good. Yeah. So and we didn't say anything.
No, you didn't say anything.
6 champions.
We said nothing verbally.
No.
We need Trisha here to scold you, though. But so anyway, so if they lose and I'm upset, as you were talking about in our discussion in the Q&A aspect, it can be a couple days. It's sort of a cloud over your existence, Monday, Tuesday, until you sort of get in the swing of things. And I've noticed that what I do is I think about my son. I give him a hug. We go and we start, we read Curious George or something else, or we put on Clifford or something, and the importance of the loss evaporates.
Absolutely.
And what's really important, my relationship with my son and spending that time, way up, right? That goes way up. And so I've used that to help. And going back to your point about sort of training your desires, the Aristotelian notion of moral habits, and trying to train that and trying to control those the negative side of being a fan. When it's not fun, and when it's stressful, and when it's and you start wondering why do I do this to myself every week? And so I do think that the changing, and also when you get married too, I think that helps too, because your wife looks at you like you're crazy, and that helps to temper some of that enthusiasm. So. Andy, you sound like you want to jump in on that.
No, I was just going to say that reminded me of one of my favorite basketball players of all time, Charles Barkley. And when he was famous and at the high point of his career, he insisted a number of times, I am not a role model. Parents are role models. And it made me think again about Carl's presentation, his discussion of all these wrestling characters, some of whom are role models, some of whom are anti-role models, the heels, right? And there is danger, and I was listening to the first part of the podcast, there is danger when people enter into fandom without a good family background, or without a good foundation of wisdom and virtue. And when they don't have that foundation, then these role models that are very destructive can be very problematic. When I'm a big Steelers fan, when Big Ben had his sojourn in Milledgeville a few years back, my son wanted a bobblehead of Roethlisberger, and I had to say no. Even though as a football player I loved him.
Right. Yeah, and that's always a struggle. And when we identify with the individual athletes, and this is relevant for one of the things you were talking about in terms of fantasy sports, where some of the shift of fandom is to the individual athletes away from the team. As Seinfeld always said, right, rooting for laundry. And I there's players that I like. Obviously, I Brady and so on, right? But
biting my tongue.
Yeah, I know.
He has a nice wife, as far as I can tell.
But generally, I like that I root for the team because I feel like the team is less likely to sojourn, as you mentioned,
except in the case of the Patriots.
Well, I knew you'd bring that up, and I mean. I assume you're referring to Spygate, the so-called Spygate, and that is an interesting moment because that's actually what inspired me to look into sports ethics, was to try to understand that situation more and to think about it more, and it had that behavior continued, or had it been, at least I don't regard it as something that. Was a common attribute of the way that they play in general. But had I seen it that way, and had it been something that was just repeated over and over again, then I would have withdrawn my fandom, or at least I hope I would have. I'd like to think I would have, for the reasons that you're mentioning.
The connections I noted today, and I think you three all kind of connected to it on some level, was. At what point do we allow ourselves to play, or are we conscious of this type of play, and how does it roll between the athlete and the fan themselves? And because I think that was what tied it back to the previous presenter, Dr. Phillips, and this idea of the warning of how hate is created in this sense, but and. Looking at this stadium and figure out to what extent do the fans engage in play, or are they spectators? And I just wonder what you guys thought was the relationship between the spectator and the fan, because I think all three of you addressed that on some level.
Right, and it's a really interesting question.
I guess in the terms of the presentation I had, in the kinds of investment and commitment I was talking about, there's a sense in which that does seem to be what makes somebody a fan, is that you're taking on and caring about something that you seem disconnected with, other than perhaps you grew up in a certain region or your parents had certain rooting interests or something like that. So in that sense, it seems to be a kind of investment, but almost a more, I don't know if I say reflective one, but doing it for very different reasons, right? You're investing as a fan in a way very different than when you're playing. But I think it's interesting to see would we prefer to think of them all involved in the same activity, right? Would we prefer to look at the stadium and say everybody here in the stadium is doing the same thing? Or do we want to say players are doing one thing, fans are doing something else? And then I think we have a lot of questions that everybody else should jump in on. Is there something derivative about that? Is there something problematic about being invested in other people's success?
I was going to just mention, I'm not sure it's problematic. I was mentioning from an Aristotelian perspective that the importance of developing moral virtue is habituation. So you have to practice being generous over and over again. And to develop practical wisdom, you have to experience a lot of different situations. Our lives are limited. So one way in which we can experience situations that aren't in our 9-to-5 lives is by identifying with others. And so the way we identify with our teams and the struggles of our teams, and a turnover and then the team fights back, we experience that along with the team. And in a way, if we respond in the right sort of way, we can participate in a development of virtue.
Would you want to distinguish between the I don't know, I guess we would call a casual fan and the fan who is who is dressing up in certain ways or carrying signs or
there does seem to be a difference. Yeah,
I think that every person's in charge of the development of their own moral character. Everyone's in charge of building a self, and we do it in many different ways. Some people don't give a flip about sports,
right,
but they're doing it in other ways, in the challenges, in community service, the challenges of their work life, of raising children. And for other people, like you mentioned a person who at a Pirates game who was dressed up as an actual pirate.
Support the team.
That might be one of his primary ways of kind of working through emotional issues.
And I think what's interesting is a lot of people would react and say there's something worrisome about that, right? Has this person invested too much? And it seems like your suggestion, and perhaps mine as well, is that there's something better about taking it to the extreme, provided other considerations, than being the casual fan. There's something more desirable about that, which is perhaps a surprising conclusion.
Well, you're putting more into it, and so the hypothesis would be you're going to get more out of it. And so to feel the lows when your team loses allows you hope, to feel the highs when they win. Rather than maybe something that's just more of a smooth thing, you might get more of a up and down curve. Now, whether that actually bears out or not is a matter of more reflection and thought. Mike?
I wonder if you want to move away from a more or less way of looking at a fan, like I'm a rabid fan or I'm a casual fan, and the different types of fans. I go to a Brewers Nationals game for the love of baseball and for to see what the pitcher does and see and the plays, and I keep score, and it's a totally different thing than when I go watch the Cardinals. Now I'm also a fan, and so I'm emotionally invested in a different way, and I have to train myself to watch like I did before so I don't bring that level of stress to the game. But on the other hand, I'm also more like a little kid where, hey, there's Jose Oquendo coaching third. I can't believe he's so close to me. So rather than more or less, I think there's different different definitions.
Definitely. Yeah, and I would just say, as to Aaron's point, that we need to be fully invested in our lives. And some people, I've never dressed up as a pirate. I probably never will. But there are other areas that I invest more in. And Michael was mentioning his fantasy football commitment is minimal. But obviously he's a passionate person with who apparently is flourishing as far as I can tell. So,
well, I like that notion of investing in the life. There should be something that in all of our lives is akin to dressing up as a pirate. Maybe it's not exactly dressing up as a pirate, but there should be something in our lives that we connect with in that way. And I think that was part of all your talks to some degree. But we got to wrap it up. We're going to continue this hopefully over some beers and food. I hope. But for now, we're gonna close it out. So thanks for joining us today on the podcast, as well in the radio show, as well as the symposium today.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, before we leave, a little special closing message from Professor Koehl Robinson.
Men are from Mars, women from Venus. When they visit the Earth, they all want to go to Sean Klein's house. I'm C-Rob. I've wined and dined with kings and queens. Slept in alleys, ate pork and beans. I'm the need you want, the want you need. Make your back crack, your knees freeze, your liver quiver. Don't dig that mess, you got the wrong address. Everyone else in the back room laughing and joking. Michael Perry out front cooking and smoking. Finally, the Rock has come back to Rockford.